Gravers to Barnabas's Boneyard. I, of course, am your host with the ghost, none other than Barnabas. And on today's episode of the Boneyard, we are going to be discussing, you guessed it based off that pun I made, The Nun 2. So, I think this is going to be a good discussion. I have a lot of thoughts about this movie to get off of my chest. It is the hot new horror film on the market, and it's already making waves at the box office like probably anybody expected. You know, it is a Conjuring universe film, and the Conjuring universe is arguably probably the most popular horror franchise out right now. You could argue that, Halloween and not even probably Paranormal Activity at this point, but some of the classic franchises that are still making movies are just as, if not more popular. But I think the Conjuring universe is probably a bit of a bigger household name at this point, just due to the frequency of its releases and the entertainment that it brings in the movie theater. Right, you get these big blockbuster horror movies that, although a lot of them feel familiar, they're fun to go watch just due to the constant jump scares and the tension and being around other horror fans who enjoy things like that, right? So I already figured this movie was going to be successful, and it seems to be tracking to be a success, which I'm more than happy for, because if we get more horror movies in theaters, then that's great. But is The Nun 2 actually a good film? That's what we're going to be trying to figure out on this episode of the Boneyard Fiends. And I also want to touch on, is it a good sequel? And I'm going to tell you right now, but I still want you to watch the rest of the video, of course, to hear my thoughts and explanations. I'm going to say no to both. So I'm going to tell you why in just a second. But of course, before we get into the analysis, I do just want to plug Grave Discussions. We are trying to push out as much content as humanly possible or inhumanly possible. And I have been lacking on the YouTube videos. It's just been a whirlwind recently, but I do intend on producing more episodes of Barnabas's Boneyard. We have a brand new episode of Grave Discussions, the podcast, coming out very soon as well, where we'll be talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre video game that came out recently. And of course, I am trying to be as active as possible on TikTok and other social media platforms as well. So make sure you're following us on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram if you're not already. And be sure to bookmark gravediscussions.net, where we also have all of our updates as well. So as far as The Nun 2 goes, I wanted to actually start off by talking about The Nun 1, because obviously it relates. It's, the predecessor to The Nun 2, and you kind of do need to watch The Nun Part 1 in order to really sort of understand Part 2. But anyway, The Nun 1 takes place in 1952 in, I believe, Romania, where Taissa Farmiga plays Sister Irene, a novitiate who is dispatched to Romania to investigate these mysterious deaths at this monastery. And she travels with Father Burke. They meet up with Frenchie, who I think we all know at this point if you've seen any of the Conjuring movies. And they uncover, for the first time in the Conjuring universe chronology, if I'm not mistaken, Valak, who is terrorizing this abbey for mysterious reasons. And of course, they have to sort of band together and defeat it, which they do. Spoiler alert. And I actually enjoyed The Nun Part 1 to some extent. I mean, I think, as far as it being a blockbuster horror film, I think it works. It keeps you entertained. It keeps the jump scares, rolling along. And I think the atmosphere actually is one of the best in the Conjuring universe catalog, just because it takes place at this sort of old Gothic abbey, right? You got the advantage of these dark and dingy hallways and corridors and these cloistered areas and everything. So I think it really puts that location to use in a great way, and is able to create this very effective vibe, right? Creepy and disturbing and uneasy. And I mean, some of the jump scares are predictable, sure, and they may be quite prevalent throughout the film, but I still think it does a decent job at creating tension and suspense and just producing a pretty fun supernatural horror movie experience. The plot is kind of whatever, but it's executed competently enough. I generally like Corin Hardy. I think his movie The Hallow was quite good, actually, one of my favorite monster movies of the last decade. So he did a respectable job with The Nun, considering that content, right? That IP and how much the studios probably interfered with that. But it was a good enough movie. So not the greatest, of course, pretty lackluster compared to horror in general, but serviceable. So was I excited for the Nun 2? Not so much, because I was expecting a lot of the same. Obviously, if you can improve on a film and a franchise and create an even better version of it and really add something substantial to that property, I think it that you have a rare win on your hands. This, in my opinion, is not it, however. And generally, I think it's actually quite a bit worse than the Nun one, and I'll explain. So let's just start right off the bat with what the movie is about. So we see the return of Sister Irene. This movie takes place 4 years after the events of The Nun Part 1. And of course, at the end of that movie, Valak was supposedly banished, right? But as we know, having seen The Conjuring Part 2, Valak still persists quite a ways after the events of The Nun Part 1, and of course, even after the events of The Nun 2. So now you're saying, was this movie really necessary? No, it wasn't necessary, but, for financial purposes, I guess it was necessary, right? Obviously, this movie is going to make a ton of money and probably even generate another sequel, but that's neither here nor there. So keeping that in mind, we know that Valak is still going to live on, but this movie is just another entry into the canon, and I think really just serves to be an entertaining sort of popcorn blockbuster horror film, right? And it generally succeeds in that goal. But Sister Irene pops back up again. Valak is in France this time, killing off a bunch of priests and other religious figures for some nefarious purpose, and Sister Irene is dispatched to investigate yet again. This time, however, she is an official nun, and she's actually accompanied by Sister Deborah, played by Storm Reed. And Sister Deborah just happens to hitch a ride with Sister Irene when she isn't supposed to, so she kind of sneaks off, and the two join forces, and they have to figure out what the hell's going on, right? So that's the basic premise. Valak seems to find her new stomping grounds, or its new stomping grounds, at this boarding school in France, where Frenchie just so happens to be working at. After the events of the Nun 1, he's still possessed by Valak against his will. And so that's what's happening. So these girls at this boarding school and the officials there are being terrorized by Valak. There's also a little girl and her mom, and the mom and Frenchie have this uneasy sort of budding romance or something going on, and he's like friends with the little girl. So that's a whole thing. It's a subplot that oftentimes seems to kind of take more prevalence than the main plot, which is odd, but it's probably the more entertaining plot in the film, probably because it features Valak, but also because you get these different character dynamics and everything, and the the girl is innocent and adorable, and you have this internal conflict with Frenchie not wanting to hurt anybody that he cares about, but housing this demonic entity, of Valak within him. So that part of the story is fairly enticing. It works well enough. Sister Irene and Sister Deborah's part is not that engaging for me personally, but I'll go into that. But yeah, that's the general premise. So let me go over what I liked about the movie first, okay? Now, I mentioned already what I liked about The Nun 1. This movie, I think, improves on The Nun 1 mostly from a technical perspective, right? So cinematography, sound design, acting, which I guess isn't really a technical element, but just bear with me. Effects for the most part, and even lighting to an extent, are typically better in The Nun 2 than The Nun 1. But that's about it for me. So let me go into what I didn't really like about the film. Okay. I mentioned the atmosphere of The Nun 1. I think the atmosphere here is quite a bit worse. And I don't know exactly what it is. I mean, you get the spooky hallways and corridors and things of that nature here, but for whatever reason, I think maybe because the location and the story is quite a bit bigger in The Nun 2, and in general the movie is just more expansive than its predecessor. It just it doesn't feel as claustrophobic. It doesn't feel as uneasy or creepy to me. And I think part of that is also, considering another big gripe that I had with the film, is that the scares are actually a bit too frequent in The Nun 2, which I think removes a lot of the suspense and tension that otherwise could have been done, and in my opinion was done a little bit more effectively in The Nun 1. So of course in this one you do get the usual setup in like the first act and maybe like halfway through the second act of the film. That's pretty standard, pretty normal, right? You get an introduction to the characters, you get a basic idea of what the plot's going to be going forward, you get a little bit of world building and everything else. And I mean, that's how it should be with any conventional film, right? So, and you get like little scares peppered in here and there, which is fine. But then once all of that gets established, pretty much, it's just like rapid fire. Like pretty much every other scene is some kind of gimmicky attempt at a jump scare. And so, in my opinion, I think with that sort of frequency, it becomes not only pretty predictable that something, spooky is going to come around the corner and try to get at you, but it also just becomes much less effective in terms of creating that good atmosphere, of creating suspense and tension and, unnerving the audience. Now, that's just my opinion. You may have a different opinion, but for me, I think the sheer prevalence of all these very gimmicky attempts at scares really does the movie a disservice, because even The Nun 1, and take other movies in the Conjuring universe, for example, like the first Conjuring, that movie does not feature the scares quite as readily. They're a little bit more spread out. They're built up a little bit better, right? You get these scenes of stability a little bit more frequently in the film, and for longer periods of time, to where you feel a bit safer, right? And so because of that, you never really know when to expect something spooky or scary. So even just a character exploring something may not necessarily mean that a demon is going to pop out or whatever. Take for example the now famous scene of the creature at the top of the wardrobe, right? That was unexpected, and that was terrifying. And that's because we didn't really know to expect that or to look for anything like that. I mean, sure, you kind of looked off here and there because it was this nighttime scene, and you kind of figured something spooky was going to happen, but it really caught you off guard. This movie kind of telegraphed a lot of its jump scares tremendously, and I don't mean that like tremendous like good. I mean just the sheer magnitude of the telegraphing of its scares is insane. And like I said, it happens nearly every other scene, or so it seems like. So in comparison, you just lose a lot of that effectiveness, in my opinion. So I don't want to ramble on too much about that. I hope that you kind of get what I'm saying with the sheer frequency of the scares, and again the gimmick of a lot of them. Like, they're just trying so hard every other scene to create a new way to show Valak, right? And I think it's kind of a drawback of having such an effective scare. One of the first few times we get Valak, you know, with the painting in, was it The Conjuring 2? I think. I probably am such a terrible horror fan right now, but I watch so much stuff, guys. You know, I can't remember everything, but you know what I'm talking about. The painting scene with Valak was super, super effective. And so now I think these filmmakers are just trying to create like new gimmicks that will overcome that one and all the other ones preceding them. You know, so this one you get the like magazine stand and everything. I don't want to say more than that, but it's just like every other scene, it feels like, is this new attempt at creating this creative new jump scare, which is great. But like I said, spread them out a little bit more, right? Don't just give us something every 5 minutes, because then it's just not as exciting. It's not as suspenseful. So that was my actually main gripe with the film. In terms of the plot, I think, like I said, it's pretty standard for a supernatural horror film. You get the protagonist seeking out a way to banish this supernatural entity, you know, this evil thing. They have to find some kind of like scholar or knowledgeable person that helps them out on their journey and everything, right? All the while they're trying to save the people that they, love. It's very familiar. It's very conventional. So if you've really seen anything like Sinister or even, The Conjuring or whatever, it's like that. So there's nothing really unique or exciting about the story, but I actually think that the plot and how it unfolds in this movie is a bit less engaging, and from a story perspective, like a script perspective, I think unfolds a little bit worse than The Nun 1 even. And it's mostly because of the finale. I think the finale feels, not even just the third act, which feels rushed and way too intense. And normally that isn't a bad thing, but I feel like it's way too much. But the actual finale, like the final big scene of the film, is just incredibly rushed, very sudden, and even introduces the sin of Deus Ex Machina, which, if you're not familiar with what that is, it's like a character or a character's inherent like realization, or even like a power up, if you will, something like that, that sort of happens or comes into the scene suddenly to resolve the conflict, right? So Google it if you need a better example. I'm probably not explaining it great, but this movie kind of features that, and in my opinion, it doesn't do well, right? Because it seems very random, and it causes the finale to be sort of unsatisfying. That's just my opinion. Other than that, I think the characters here are also not developed the best, especially Storm Reed's character. She has promise at the beginning of the movie, but then the movie doesn't really give her much to build off of. and she has sort of a character arc that kind of gets resolved, but I just don't think the movie gives her enough to really be anything but a background character, and she really plays second fiddle to Sister Irene, who also doesn't get that much great character development here besides in like flashbacks, which is annoying. So yeah, unfortunately, Storm Reed's character is just kind of a sidekick, and even Sister Irene is not extremely exciting as the protagonist of this film. I think the best characters, as I mentioned before, are probably Frenchie and the little girl that he's friends with, and her mom, I guess. So, yeah, the characters not very enticing, not that interesting. The story also not that interesting, very samey. The finale, if I can be blunt, sucks in my opinion, and the atmosphere and the scares are just not built up in a very effective way. So for those reasons, I would have to give The Nun 2 a 2 out of 5. And just for reference, I gave The Nun 1 a 3 out of 5, which, all things considering, is probably generous. But here's what I'll say. It's a caveat, right? It's still an entertaining blockbuster horror film, but don't expect much other than that, right? This is definitely the kind of movie that you can put on and sort of mindlessly watch on like a weeknight or on a weekend with like a bowl of popcorn and, cuddled up or whatever, So it's entertaining enough in that regard. And I think that's probably what they were intending to do anyway. And so for that reason, it's probably a success. But anything more than that, if I have to review it critically, which that's kind of my job here, it's not a very good film and it's not a very good sequel, but it does its job at least at entertaining you with some dumb jump scares and a dumb enough plot. So that's what I think about it. I want to know your thoughts though. If you liked it, great. And I'm really happy for you. And I want to hear why you liked it and your thoughts on it. And even The Nun 1, if you have any particularly passionate feelings about that, leave them in the comments of this video down below. And yeah, let me know what other movies you guys want me to review on here. I'm also going to be posting a quick review to TikTok. So just to reiterate, follow us on there, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and follow us. It really helps us branch out and grow a bigger audience and make more videos like this. And yeah, until next time, I am Barnabas, and we'll see you back here on the Boneyard.